Now that we've learned a little bit about the history of JavaScript, we're going to get into the language itself, how it compares to some other languages like Python, which is a language we've already seen in this course, and Java, another language that you might be familiar with that does share some things in common with JavaScript. So JavaScript itself mostly runs in a browser. Now, there are other applications for JavaScript, but most of the JavaScript that's in production today is probably running within browsers. And we can use JavaScript for communicating with servers. We can use it to dynamically load sections of content from the server. We can add some interactivity. It makes our applications a little bit more dynamic in the user interface. The syntax itself is mostly C style. It's going to be similar to the style that you've seen in Java or C# or C++ or C. Any of these languages are going to have some commonalities, like the way that if statements have parentheses and how sections of your code are separated by curly braces. Now, one of the challenges when working with JavaScript is its weak typing. This can lead to a lot of issues. Basically with Python, you have this, all of your data has this type, like an int is an int. Whereas in JavaScript, the types are a little bit more dynamic and not quite as well defined. One instance where this kind of hit me was I was writing an application that needed to work with large numbers, and those numbers were read in as strings, so anytime you printed them out, they were working perfectly fine, but there wasn't enough precision to capture those large numbers, so a lot of the content of those numbers was being removed, which led to a lot of problems when trying to compare the numbers. So, this kind of thing can be a little bit challenging when you're working with JavaScript. JavaScript does support runtime evaluation, so what you can do is you can use an eval statement to execute JavaScript dynamically, and that's a really bad idea and leads to really difficult to understand code, so probably it's not a good idea to do this. But you do have access to these types of statements. Just in general, it's going to cause issues and make your code very difficult to maintain. So I generally recommend not using runtime evaluation if you can avoid it, and you can always avoid it. One interesting thing about JavaScript is that it has first-class functions. Basically, this means that your functions are objects themselves. So, this allows you to do some clever and interesting things with functions. You can pass them as parameters to other functions, or you can use them in a variable type of way. And this is something that's led JavaScript to be somewhat functional sometimes. So a lot of languages are procedural, a lot of languages are object-oriented, but sometimes people do write JavaScript in more of a functional way. The implementation of JavaScript can be a little bit unpredictable because you're writing for an environment that you can't necessarily predict or control. Your JavaScript code, depending on how you write it, might be running in the Mozilla Firefox browser or the Google Chrome browser or the Microsoft Edge browser or any one of 3 or 4 other browsers that are prominent. It could be running in old versions of browsers. In fact, if you start writing libraries for JavaScript, they might not even be running in browsers at all. And how that actually operates can be kind of difficult to predict. And, so it makes the language a little bit harder to use than something like Java, where the Java virtual machine is going to be pretty consistent even as you move across operating systems. So, comparing the style of Java to Java and Python to JavaScript, in JavaScript we're going to separate our sections into by braces instead of using white space. So that's very similar to what you see in Java. In JavaScript we can use single or double quotes for strings just like we can in Python, and escaping works very similarly. With JavaScript it's not quite as terse as Python. It's typically not as verbose as Java. So the language itself tends to be a little bit more compact, but probably not as compact as the code that you might write in Python. In Java, we use camel casing, and we typically use that in JavaScript. JavaScript itself is camel cased, if you think about that. So in Python, we tend to use underscores. So one way that you can kind of keep yourself in the right mind frame while you're working on these applications is to keep language consistency in Python and use underscores, and keep language consistency in JavaScript and use your camel casing. The variables in JavaScript, they're dynamically or weakly typed. So in Java, we have statically typed variables. We have to set the type when we declare them. Python, we don't set that type, but we do have variables, or our data itself has a type. In Java, we use null. In JavaScript, we use null, and there's also an undefined value that we'll get into as we explore the language. In JavaScript, we actually never set a type, and the type of the variable is inferred based on the data, but it's not, like I said, not quite consistent all the time. If you don't know all of the ways that it can execute, you might be surprised. In scope, dynamic, the scope of JavaScript, with Java, your variables are scoped to the section where they're declared. Python, they're also scoped to the section where they're declared in your code. And in JavaScript, their scope to the function scope, it works a little bit different. We'll get into some examples of this when we get into variables within JavaScript. But function scope variables basically mean that you can actually use variables sometimes before you even declare them in JavaScript. So you can do some things in JavaScript that look a little weird and operate a little bit weirdly, but they are legal in the language. Now, as far as structures, JavaScript has dynamic arrays similar to what you might have in Python with dynamic lists. You actually can't declare a static array in JavaScript, or at least not any way that I know. So building more complex data structures within the language itself can sometimes be challenging. Java has map and Python has dictionaries. JavaScript has object, which is something that people have used historically like a map, but now there is a map object available in JavaScript, which works pretty effectively, probably a little bit better than using an object as a map. In Java, we use a contains keyword to see if something exists in some other structure. Python uses that in keyword. Sorry, Java is not a keyword, it's a method. But in JavaScript, we don't really have a membership test for objects. That's not something, you kind of have to do that manually. In declaring arrays, in Java, we declare an int array with int and then the square brackets, and then we have to create that integer array. With Python, we just use list or we use empty square brackets. And in JavaScript, we can also use that empty square bracket notation, which is pretty common. You sometimes see new array, but generally you see that second value there, let int array equal the empty square brackets. As far as the paradigms here, JavaScript is actually multi-paradigm, similar to Python. You often see event-driven JavaScript, imperative JavaScript, functional JavaScript. You can make JavaScript object-oriented. You can kind of work in a couple of different ways when you're writing JavaScript. And the objects in JavaScript are dynamic, which means you can add properties and methods to them as you wish. They're not set. They're not explicit like they are in Java. In Java, you have to declare everything. You have to write it out, which is one of the things that adds the verbosity of Java. JavaScript, you can just sort of throw them together on the fly. Access control is a little bit complex in JavaScript. Now the language has evolved a little bit to make that a little bit more easy to access. So there are closures in JavaScript where you can kind of control the actual scoping of your variables or of your properties so that they are not necessarily public. However, in most use cases, the JavaScript that you write will probably won't require that level of control, at least not for the purposes of this class. In Java, we have method overloading, and in Python, we actually have optional parameters. In JavaScript, we can use optional parameters, but we actually don't overload functions in JavaScript. So in JavaScript, we can have optional parameters. And there's also an arguments array that's just sort of implicit. Even a lot of experienced JavaScript programmers aren't aware of this, but it just sort of exists in every function that you write. And it represents the arguments that were passed to that particular function. So that's a quick overview of the structure of the language. In the next lecture, we'll start getting into the syntax and how the language actually operates. But for now, thank you for watching.